Okay, I think that we'll make a start. And a very warm welcome to this Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment webinar. And this one is on children and the hostile environment. My name's Anne Phoenix, and I'm co-chairing the session with Eleanor Kaufman, who will chair the question session after the speakers have given their talks. So I'm going to say a little bit, literally 2 sentences, about Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment and why it's important to think about children when thinking about the hostile environment. I'll then introduce the speakers, who will each speak for about 15 minutes. And the final part of the webinar is dialogue. So please do post your comments and questions in the chat, and Eleanor will invite you either to give them or read them out later on. We are recording the webinar, so if you don't want to be recorded or shown, then when you ask a question, you need not give your name or to turn on your camera. But if you don't mind being recorded, it's always lovely to see who is asking a question. So then do turn on your camera at that point. The Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment is a project that was started by a special interest group on refugees, migration and settlement by some fellows of the Academy of Social Sciences. So it's not an Academy of Social Sciences group, but it was started in that way. And we work on issues of racism, migration, everyday bordering, intersectionality in the UK and globally. And we are a broad group of social scientists. So that we are really interested in informing public debates. We think that as social scientists, we have a duty to do that, and therefore also to challenge the hostile environment and to challenge government policy for migrants and so on. It's an open organization, so if anybody would like to join, you can email Neera Yuval Davis at any point and be put on the mailing list. And we'll meet next Monday, for example, just to think about how this webinar has gone and to think about the future. And in June, we are having the next webinar is going to be on identity politics and also promises to be very exciting and important. So this session then, it's on children and the hostile environment, and it's certainly timely. It comes as the 2023 illegal immigration bill is being debated and contested even by Conservative MPs like Theresa May, for example. And one of the reasons that it's being contested is its impact on families and children. Now, children have always been integral to issues of migration, whether they've migrated with others, often family members, or on their own. And they've always been involved in both being subject to hostile environment policies and certainly migration policies, and as well as negotiating those policies in the everyday and helping other family members to do so as well. So children are not simply always passive. Some do a great deal around migration to make things easier for themselves and sometimes for family members as well. Well, if the illegal immigration bill is passed into law, the resulting act will allow the detention of families with children and even the deportation of unaccompanied children if it's deemed to be safe to deport them to their countries of origin. It will also mean that children whose parents are deemed to have entered the UK illegally, and most people will be deemed to have entered the UK illegally if they seek asylum in Britain, it will mean that the children can never become UK citizens. And yet there are still people alive now who are being celebrated for having been unaccompanied child migrants. And I think of Hella Pick, for example, who came to Britain in 1939 when she was aged 11 as an unaccompanied migrant on the Kindertransport. She was one of 1,000 children who came in the wake of Kristallnacht. And she has been very helpful in making clear her opposition to this bill for what it will do to children and their chances, and so on, pointing out how important it is to welcome children in. We also know that children who are here and are unaccompanied are not looked after well. You'll have seen on the flyer to this session that several children have simply disappeared, even though some have now been accounted for. There are still children who are missing, who've been put into accommodation by the government. So it raises all sorts of issues about what children's experiences are, how they're being cared for, and the UK duty of care for children who are unaccompanied migrants and so on. And yet we frequently do not hear anything about what children's experiences are, what they think about those experiences. And unless we can do that, we can't really campaign to make things better. We can't really bring to people's attention the issues that affect children in the hostile environment. So today's speakers are particularly well placed to address these issues. And they're well placed to do so from policy and from practice perspectives. So our speakers in order of their speaking are Jen Persson, who's director of the not-for-profit organization Defend Digital Me, and that campaigns for children's privacy and broader digital rights in the UK, in UK education and the wider public sector. And Defend Digital Me was a founding member of the Against Borders for Children Schools ABC coalition. And she has worked on the campaign to oppose the expansion of the school census to collect children's nationality and country of birth data, which was between 2016 and 2020, that Schools ABC was centrally involved with. And some recent research and publications from Defend Digital Me include Privacy and Protection, a children's rights approach to encryption, which came out earlier this year and was produced in collaboration with Child Rights International Network. Also, The State of Biometrics, which came out last year and maps the application and growing use of biometric data in schools, as well as The Words We Use in Data Policy, which came out in 2021, which was a report on language and young people in UK data policy. And all of these build on the State of Data 2020 report, in which Defend Digital Me presented 5 years of research that mapped the data landscape in, across, and leaving the state education sector in England. So I think you can see that that is absolutely central to our interests and our concerns here tonight. Our second speaker is Nando Sigona. And Nando is Professor of International Migration and Forced Displacement, as well as being the director of the Institute for Research into Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Nando is a founding editor of the peer-reviewed journal Migration Studies and lead editor for Global Migration and Social Change, which is a book series published by Bristol University Press. Nando's research interests include the migration and citizenship nexus, undocumented migration, naturalization, denaturalization, and statelessness, as well as Romani politics and anti-Gypsyism, and asylum and the EU, including Brexit and intra-European mobility, as well as the thing that he's going to be talking about tonight, which is child and youth migration. And our third speaker is Rachel Rosen. And Rachel is an associate professor at UCL's Social Research Institute. Her research focuses on children and families who have precarious migration status in the UK's neoliberal border regime. She has a co-edited collection in Spanish and English, called Crisis for Whom? Critical Global Perspectives on Childhood, Care and Migration. And that was released this year in January. And of course, she's got numerous other publications, as has Nando. So I'd like to welcome the three of you to speak to us. We're very much looking forward to what you have to say. And if you could each speak for roughly 15 minutes, if you go on for a minute more, I won't cut you off, but much more than that. And I'll have to, in the interests of getting discussion in later. So thank you very much. And Jen, the floor's yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Anne. That's a terrific introduction. And thank you for the invitation this evening. So without having to elaborate on why and how my involvement in the Against Borders for Children story came about, I'll start by saying the Against Borders for Children campaign story is a success story of grassroots campaigners and collective action. In fact, some of you this evening here may even have been involved. The campaign involved a huge number and a whole lot of different people and organizations at different times. Someone once said to me that people have a habit of showing up when they are needed. When we were researching the uses of national pupil data in 2015 and 16, I did not know what the implications would be when we started to discover that the Home Office had access to education data. But people working hard for years in the anti-racism or the migrants' rights field years before me did. And together we collectively formed the campaign coalition Against Borders for Children. But while it's also a success story, it's also a story of failure of our policymakers, of legislative scrutiny, of institutional accountability. And it's also a story of boring perseverance. It's a campaign that's not over yet, and we still have a call to action. So how did it start? I'll go through what happened in the process. I'll go through how the children's data is being used, and I'll go through what happened in the campaign as well. So first, I want to take you back 7 years. In spring 2016, the Department for Education announced it would start collecting children's nationality and country of birth in the school census from September 2016. Now, bear in mind the political context. This is in and around the vote to leave the EU, before and after. At the time, the public and MPs were told that this collection of nationality and country of birth data in the school census, that's a collection that happens every term from every child in state education, that's around 8 million children whose personal data is collected 3 times a year, sent from schools and educational institutions to the Department for Education, and is added to a national pupil database and kept, as far as we know, indefinitely, including everyone's personal details, their home address, their ethnicity, hundreds of pieces of personal data. So the fact that nationality and country of birth would be added was justified for reasons such as research and internal DfE purposes, even to enhance the understanding of the level of additional support children who have come into the English education system from abroad may require. To the best of my knowledge today, that was a lie. We've never seen any evidence of those claims. But the truth that we discovered was that the department had already begun sharing national pupil records with the Home Office for immigration enforcement purposes a year earlier, in July 2015. And the fact that nationality, once collected, was already written into that live agreement to be included in data handovers once collected only emerged after we discovered it in autumn 2016, and not through ministerial statements that had been made in Parliament that summer, or answers to parliamentary questions given by the Department for Education, but through freedom of information requests. Because the schools minister, Nick Gibb, told Parliament in 2016, when he was asked about the nationality data about to be added in the school census, that there are currently no plans to share the data with other government departments. He effectively hid the fact for some time that data distribution of other data from the same data set had already begun a year earlier. This excluded the nationality and country of birth but he was asked about disclosure of information to other government departments. So in summary, in July 2015, the Department for Education had begun handing over personal details monthly to the Home Office from records stored in the National Pupil Database, in secret, without any public or parliamentary scrutiny or debate. The document about the data sharing, already signed off, said nationality once collected would be among the data shared. And yet 8 months later, when the schools were being told that the census would be expanded, that fact was kept secret. And it was not only hidden from schools and the public and Parliament. I've been told by members of the department's own data approvals board, who signs off new data expansions, the Star Chamber, that they had no idea. In fact, one told me they were horrified to think that they had approved the collection of nationality and didn't know that it was already signed off to go to the Home Office. So this is not only a failure of process, but a failure of internal scrutiny. Not only that, but the department then used that no one had raised concerns at that board as a reason to justify to the board, to the scrutiny of the legislation then, that nobody had raised concerns and therefore this legislative change was acceptable. But of course, that board couldn't have raised concerns because they had been kept in the dark. So the first campaign success was also won in secret. It was that the data sharing agreement had been amended in October 2016 to take nationality back out of the monthly data items shared after pressure in the press and campaign and lobbying, even though at that point, no one had actually seen this data sharing agreement, but more of these successful outcomes later. What really tipped the story into action and change was a result of political embarrassment. There was a leak to the BBC behind closed doors that in 2015, the government had made hostile environment expansion plans to deprioritize migrants in the school's admission process and carry out immigration checks through schools. And there was political outcry across parties, and even Nicky Morgan, who had been 2015 Education Secretary, had written to the Prime Minister David Cameron with profound concerns about the Home Office's plans for schools at that time. So this story is not only a story of failure of what is right, of ethics, of what we should and shouldn't be doing around pupils' data, for example, or a process failure of data oversight or data protection law. Much more significantly, there's a practice failure of internal oversight and accountability in a department. And perhaps what is even more significant at the policy level, there's a failure of our national democratic processes, a failure of safe, accountable lawmaking. And as I see it, the subordination of the government department tasked with children's well-being, education and care to the unaccountable authority of the Home Office. So how does this process, the pupil data for immigration enforcement, happen? In short, the Home Office has a wanted list and the DfE helps find them. By searching the data set of over 21 million people from multiple DfE controlled databases, the Department for Education attempts to match pupils' records with the hundreds of people's names that the Home Office gives them every month. The personal data handed over, if they find a match, includes up to 5 years of past home addresses, for example, including school address. And if wanted, in questions later, we can get into the details of the data sharing agreement first signed off in 2015 and the immigration laws it relies on. But in summary, the strategic purposes expressly include to create a hostile environment for those who seek to benefit from the abuse of immigration control and to reduce the illegal migration population. So the failure for individuals and communities is also potentially catastrophic. It's not known what safeguards, if any, there are in place for errors in this process, or if there are any routes for redress. We know school staff have said they have been worried if families were told that if the school staff had been told that families might be picked up from school and what they should do. They have worried about children and their families who've been in school and then vanished overnight. So that's the failures. But who was involved? What makes this a success story? Over 20 supporting organisations with many notable individual contributions in their own ways and from organisations in different ways over the 5 years have been extremely important. Powerfully, it was because of all the people who did the bulk of the work. Migrants' rights activists, anti-racism campaigners, teachers, parents, young migrants groups, support groups themselves. Teaching unions got involved. Politicians of all major parties spoke out as these truths emerged. 5 departments for education ministers spoke about this in the House of Commons and the Lords. There was civil society involvement, civil servants. It involved this scrutiny board, the House of Lords Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, the UK Statistics Authority, the Information Commissioner's Office, the Information First Tier Tribunal, journalists. But most of all, the change came about through the school boycott. And that was successfully organised by the grassroots campaigners who worked so hard together with school staff. And 2% of parents who actively refused to provide the data in the census meant that the schools returned altogether and not collected nationality and country of birth for nearly a quarter of pupils. That meant the data quality was very poor. We mustn't forget as well, in April 2017, the NUT, as it was then, conference supported motions opposing nationality and country of birth collection and calling for more information to be given to schools and parents. There was a step 1 where the Lord Nash at the time in the House of Lords allowed a right to have the data withdrawn again. So once parents had submitted it, and then we were able to prove that they had not known this would be used for these types of purposes, parents could exercise a right to object through schools and have their data withdrawn again. And then a year later, in April 2018, the government did a complete U-turn and stopped collecting the nationality and country of birth in the census at all. 2 more years later, in February 2020, we pursued that the data quality was so poor and that data, if being used at all, were not used for the purposes that it had been told schools that it would be used for. So therefore it wasn't necessary to keep it. We pursued this, and because you can't simply retain data indefinitely without a legal basis unless it is necessary, and thanks to that school census boycott, we could show that this data wasn't being used or kept for the correct purposes, and it was eventually destroyed in November 2020. So what worked in summary? This huge collective action from a huge number of people over a long time, significant parliamentary and press attention, and the boycott from parents stopped the collection and eventually got it destroyed. However, the monthly handovers continue of all the other data items. So between July 2015 and September 2022, that's the most recently available data, the Home Office requested the matching of nearly 7,000 individuals. And they were given the data from 1,780 from these Department for Education monthly searches of the entire database. Now, we're arguing that this is neither necessary proportionate use of over 21 million records. Shockingly, but perhaps unsurprisingly, neither department takes any responsibility or even seems to know what happens to the children or their family members as a result of these monthly pupil data matches. Caroline Lucas MP asked the Home Office in 2020 about the impact of using pupil data from the DfE, but the Home Office declined to provide it in a parliamentary question, and the DfE has refused our request through Freedom of Information. So this is not over. What's next? Collectively again, and thanks to perhaps some of you on the call this evening and others, we have again over 25 different organisations and individuals who have asked in a letter to the Information Commissioner that they impose an immediate and definitive limitation on this practice, as we see it non-compliant with data protection law. Liberty and Against Orders for Children had already pursued a legal complaint much earlier in 2018, but due to timing and the complexities of the legal system, it was not given permission to proceed. So we are continuing this through the regulatory route because we're deeply concerned that any continuing opaque practices around the processing of children into the immigration system is unsafe. We simply want this unlawful, unethical policy and practice to stop. We are also concerned that right now in Parliament, in fact, as we're speaking, the data protection laws are again seeking to be changed by this government, that they have a new data protection and digital information bill in Parliament as we speak. And this will again put in weaker safeguards for children and adults around the use of personal data, both for immigration purposes and for many other reasons. So this story is far from over, but it's certainly a success story in terms of over 20 supporting organizations with all these notable contributions in many ways over many years. And whilst we think there are still significant failures in terms of process, policy and practice, I hope we can also be very grateful to everybody that's contributed and recognize the success that just people on the ground working together in coalition can bring about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. That's wonderful, and also, you know, really heartening to start off with, you know, a success, however much you still need to do, and that we all still need to do. That's really heartening to hear, and thanks also for sticking to time. So, Nando, can I invite you now to give your talk?
Thank you very much. And Jen, thank you for the fantastic talk. Really, actually, we see how it's also connected some of the things I'm going to say around the deification of migration in general and within the global context. I mean, perhaps the place from which I want to start is like two questions. Who counts as a migrant child, but also which migrant children counts? The point of this question is not just rhetorical, as I would say. I mean, with Rachel Humphreys a couple of years ago, we wrote a piece of work thinking about the issue of visibility and invisibility when it comes to migrant children. Which migrant do we talk about in the public conversation? Which migrant children appear within the policy debate, in the media, in the interest of NGOs, etc.? I think it's a really fundamental question. And it's a question, so the point is not only about which groups are visible and which groups are invisible, but also in what ways we make visible some groups. And here is when one of the principal concepts on which the protection of children is based, you know, the principle of the best interest, can also be transformed. And we will see how, when we talk about migrants, we have seen in some cases the weaponization of the best interest of the child against the children with the purpose of immigration control. So, and the way in which this visibility and visibility is managed within it's through instruments. We talk about the bureaucratic capture of the migrant children through the use of labeling and categorization, but also the use of data, both in terms of and knowledge practice. So which data are we collecting? Not just the data itself, but even decision on the data that we collect are really fundamental. And finally, also through the role of social services, this capture of some groups of migrant specific way. And one of the things which is, I think, was more striking, and I'm drawing on a number of projects I've been carrying out in the last 15 plus years, is to think about not just at the groups that we always talk about. I mean, we've seen in the news recently the discussion around the disappearance and the missing unaccompanied minors in Kent region. But what is actually also interesting for me is to notice that there are other groups of children in the asylum system which we never talked about. And one of them is actually the dependent children. So the dependent children of asylum seekers, which actually numerically is a much larger number of the unaccompanied minors, are completely absent from the public debate. Even when, and this is actually interesting, when we talk about the asylum backlog, which is very much at the center of the current debate in the United Kingdom, no? The 160,000 cases which are undecided. What happened to the children, which are in many of the families of these undecided cases, if they just spend years in limbo without knowing what's happened? What happened to their education, their access to rights, to the fact that they're often kept in hotel for years? We don't know, hotel with their families, but they are still kept in rooms, overcrowded, in poor condition, in isolated place, without possibility of building relationships. What is the impact on their mental health, for example, or on their future? The other group that we rarely talked about, and in the past I've worked on undocumented migrant children and families in UK when I was at the University of Oxford a few years ago, with Vanessa Hughes, was to look at how absent in the discussion around illegal immigration or undocumented migration is the condition of children and families and parents. So there are hundreds of thousands of children which are in families that are undocumented or in families without legal status. Some of them are not even born, are actually born in the United Kingdom, but still called migrants themselves. Again, these children are invisible, and their invisibility is not by chance. It's actually a way of escaping the responsibility when it comes, for example, on the impact of immigration enforcement on access to education, access to health. Some of the work we did was, for example, exploring the higher incidence of infant mortality when it comes to undocumented parents and migrants with precarious legal status. And one of the reasons that came out was because people were not accessing antenatal and postnatal care. They were scared about it because they were first, and also were unable to pay the fees, the cost of accessing the hospital for giving birth. So there was a lot of risk associated with the immigration enforcement operate on these invisible children. And instead, when we talk about unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, they are much more visible in the debate. And it's interesting how, just to give a sense, at the moment, a lot of local authorities are talking about an invasion of an unaccompanied child. They are unable to cope with them. And you imagine hundreds of thousands of children and minors that are knocking on the doors of Britain. And actually, you go looking at the numbers and you see that it's in a few thousand young people. It's just a few thousand. Normally, actually, for over a decade, the average was around 3,500, 4,000. Now it's a bit higher. But it is still, just to give you an example, it's still about 7 times less than what Sweden received in 2015, which was about 36,000 young asylum-seeking children. So, and Sweden, as you know, is a few times smaller in terms of population than Britain. So it's really interesting, this idea of the visibility and the attention to these groups, and reflecting critically why it's the case, I think is interesting. Obviously, these are children often are in vulnerable position. They don't have their families, parents support. They need support. That's obviously important, etc. But there is more in this attention to this group that I think we need to unpack. And maybe in a kind of and very much this one of the reasons why we talked about them, and also in the way they are framed. This is where the visibility is also about framing. And they are deserving of our attention very often because they are constructed as the quintessential victim, as passive, etc. So the moment in which there is some form of manifestation of agency, the other consider adult, so they are no longer children by definition. They fail the children test, or they may have been forced by someone else to do things that they will never do by themselves. Okay. Any one of us that has a work with unaccompanied minors, has interviewed them, has shared experience, they know that these are very brave. They've gone through very tough experience, terrible, but they're also full of agency, capacity to take decisions. They have been sort of forced to become adult in a sense by their experience, the experience of migration. In some cases, the experience of migration is part of the life trajectory, is a moment of transition that's part of this choice. So one of the things in the past I've been writing about was around this issue of the children, the unaccompanied minor going missing and why they were going missing. And the different ways that going missing, what does going missing means? And to me, there are two questions that we need to think about. Who are they going missing from and why? No? If you disappear from an asylum center or an hotel, which looks like a prison in some cases, who are you disappearing from? Is it really possible for hundreds of people to just be pushed out by the people working from the home office, and then there were criminals grabbing them from outside the house and taking them away? But really, is that the case? The fact that people disappear, they might have multiple reasons. It's sure there are cases of exploitation, this case of human trafficking, but actually the answer is probably more varied and still highlight the vulnerability that are produced by the immigration regime. The fact of saying that children may decide to disappear from the home office doesn't take away any sort of important from our point of view of what is this thing, this gesture meaning. Because actually, if they submit from the home office, it's certainly true that they put themselves at risk because they may are more easy to be exploitable. I mean, we have met a lot of young people that in order to survive had to sleep on couch in different houses. They had to work paid almost nothing in restaurants or cleaning car. You know, the point is not that going missing means, you know, from home office, even if they're not being kidnapped, it's still a very important issue. And but it to me highlights something else, that the migration regime in UK is changing. And this means that at some point in this cycle of engaging with the migration regime, if you cannot go back home or you don't want, for a number of pressure you are in going back home, disappearing is one of your few options that are left to you, even if it's a risky one. And looking at more broadly to the European case studies, I may always use two examples, Italy and Sweden. If you look at the disappearance of unaccompanied minors in these two countries, they come at different points in the migration cycle. In Italy, young people tend to disappear early on. So, and this was, for example, the cases during the 2010s of the Egyptian young people. Italy had the bilateral agreement with Egypt that meant that if there were Egyptian national going on the boat crossing into Libya, into Italy, if they were adult, they were sent back straight away to Egypt. There was a direct return, but this was not affecting minors. So interestingly, the only Egyptian you will see on the boat that were arriving from Libya or Tunisia into Italy were actually minors. And once they were registered into Italy, they were just disappearing from the system. They were moving to Europe elsewhere. They were moving northern Italy, working in pizzeria, etc. What they certainly didn't want was to be kept into a closed center, a bit like a prison, being unable to do anything and just wait for being treated as infantile children. In Sweden, there was a different process. What we observed was that young people tend to disappear the sooner they will get to age 18. So at the end of the experience of being a migrant children in a Nordic country, because basically there was no future for them. There was no future once your protection as a minor disappeared. And that was when they were sort of either moved elsewhere in Europe or they were basically going into the underground. So it's quite important to understand what kind of effects the migration regime may produce and what options are left in an increasingly restrictive environment. The other thing, so this is where I think it's also important to look at the best interest and the protection of children through this best interest principle. As everyone knows, is at the core of the architecture that was built within the UNCRC, the UN Charter for the Right of Children, and it's very much central to how we approach also then has been sort of enshrined within the British legal system, etc. But the best interest of children, what we see by observing how countries and institutions use it, is very much used in a way and also often where rather than in a way that is weaponized, we can say, but also instrumentalized, so to enforce different forms of immigration control. This is why, for example, we don't care about the best interests of the children when they are in the independent families, because we don't want to have to give the rights to parents because they are there. But we may be open to give the rights to the children if they are alone, actually. And if the parents are there, we can criminalize the parents and say you are very bad parents. So there is all an issue of parenting that goes in parallel with this. And this is, and what we are seeing now in recent work is two movements in terms of how this best interest is used and weaponized. One is internal, one is external. So the first process is externalization, I call it, of best interest. And is what we are seeing in the way that the Global Compact on Migration are incorporating or concern for minor migration children. For the first time, we can say in the Compact on Migration, which is this instrument that were developed in 2016 and then were ratified in 2018, following the European refugee crisis, we see an attention to the position of migrant children. One of the things that is happening is that basically is pushing, this instrument is very much pushing the responsibility on the best interests of the child on transit countries. Okay? So what we are seeing is everyone talks of the compact saying, oh, now Mali or Niger has to play a role in the migration governance. We send the money from the European Union to do border checks for us. Interestingly, this instrument also say that this transit country have to take care of the children. They have to protect the best interests. This has become almost a way of legitimize the fact that, well, if the children migrants can be treated well in the transit countries, then the only reason why we protect the migrant children in Europe as well is no longer there, because you know, they were treated well before. There is no longer almost is undermining one of the arguments that legitimized the protection of the migrant children once they came into the European space. So it's a very interesting instrument that will need to be monitored how it's used in these transit places. We have seen interesting work, for example, done around Morocco and the role of Morocco in the global compacts. The other process, and I finish, is around this idea of outsourcing. And again, I wrote with Rachel Humphreys around the outsourcing and privatization of the best interest of the child. What we're seeing within UK, and we observed in particular when we went to talk with social workers that were dealing with migrant unaccompanied minors, was this idea that migrant children were sent away from the local authorities that responsibility for them towards other local authorities. This was not yet a transfer of responsibility. This is not about the municipality, you know, a borough of London getting in touch with Leicester municipality and say, you are in charge of that. They were basically going to the private sector at the housing and just rent rooms that, because they were cheap, this was a justification, for children that were still under responsibility of the London borough. So they put a physical distance in the responsibility, in a sense we're outsourcing literally in that sense. But also what we notice, and this is interesting, where all the process of the skilling and the way that the flexibilization of work works, and also the structuring of the welfare system operate, what we saw is that the people in charge for these young people, the social workers, gradually were also going through a process of restructuring. So increasingly, the ones that were put in charge of the migrant children were no longer experienced social worker, but very often were people that were at the very bottom of the salary scale with low level of expertise in the area or experience, and they very often didn't know what they were doing. So there was this sense that even without changing the legislation, I changed the structure that govern the presence of migrant children. And this was what I mean by sort of privatization, in this case, of the best interest and outsourcing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nando. I mean, really thought-provoking in terms of thinking about, you know, what does it mean to think about the best interests of children, and the overlap between children who are devalued within the society, who are not migrants, and those who are migrants. So that weaponizing and instrumentalizing, I think, is a really important way to think about it. So thank you for that. And I think it fits nicely, or it leads into Rachel Rosen's talk very well, with a slightly different focus. So Rachel, welcome.
Thank you. Let me just get my screen. Sorry, I'm going to do the terrible PowerPoint thing here if I can. Okay. Okay, great. So yeah, I will absolutely pick up, I think, on some of the points Nando was making, and I'll touch on those as we go along. It's really good to be here. So I wanted to start, as Anne did, with the horrible illegal migration bill. And during one of the heated debates in Parliament, one of the things that Suella Braverman stated is that the proposed new law to detain and deport any migrant who arrives via an unauthorized route will not be applied to unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. So setting aside whether that claim is actually consistent with the letter of the law of the bill she's put forward, Anne's already suggested that it's not, and I think many people do contest that, as well as the fact that there are simply no state-sanctioned routes to enter the UK to claim asylum. I think Braverman's statement reflects many public, political, as well as academic understandings of the position of lone migrant children. And this is, I think, what Nando was also getting at in his talk. And so despite Britain's increasingly restrictive and hostile migration regime, which renders mobility a criminal act, particularly when it's undertaken by poor Black and Brown people, It's often assumed that unaccompanied children should be and are a special group who are largely protected from the violences of the sovereign and borders and everyday racialized bordering practices. Because they are seen, again, Nando, picking up on Nando's points, they're often seen to embody innocence, non-responsibility, essential vulnerability, and exceptional suffering. And so they are seemingly entitled to support unavailable to other groups of migrants. So to be sure, I think that there's age or generation works as a filtering tactic in restrictive bordering regimes, vis-a-vis care, protection, and residency. So there's no doubt that some of these entitlements are very different and that the trope of the unaccompanied child works in producing that. But I think this is very different than saying that, sort of accepting the claims of a neoliberal state that children, especially those who are unaccompanied, are the beneficiaries of special protection and care, or their actual experiences in countries like the UK accord with these sort of positive suppositions. So Miriam Tickton, a brilliant ethnographer and author, I think she provides some powerful clues as to the risks, both politically and intellectually, of accepting discourses of sort of humanitarian care as empirical reality for their intended or seeming beneficiaries. She demonstrates that a humanitarian focus on those experiencing exceptional human suffering in fact serves as a form of violent migration governance, producing what she calls casualties of care, or casualties of a care system. And this includes both those who are deemed deserving of care and seem to receive care, as well as those who are rejected from care systems on spuriously moral grounds. So in what follows, I want to try and build on some of Tickton's arguments, troubling discourses about the reality of the special protected status, or the best interest of the success of the best interest of the child principle for unaccompanied children in England's children's services. And to do so, I'm drawing on the Children Caring on the Move project, which I've been co-leading for the past 4 years. In this project, we're examining unaccompanied children's experiences of receiving and giving care in England's immigration welfare nexus. We've done over 180 interviews with relevant professionals, policymakers, business owners, and unaccompanied children themselves have been involved in designing the research and carrying it out and taking part. So Anne talked about the importance of understanding and hearing children's perspectives on these issues. And while that has been essential, or is a central part of the CALM project, it's not going to be what I'm directly talking about today, although the topic will be something that has come from young people themselves. So what I want to do is trace the ways that unaccompanied children in England are contained and enclosed in unregulated, outsourced, and for-profit forms of state care, until they are ejected at the culmination of their inevitable march to legal adulthood. An enclosure which I suggest makes it more likely they will be subject to enforced destitution or deportation as undeserving and not adult citizens. So just briefly, by way of some background, Nando's already touched on this, but the UK has actually received and accepted and granted protection to very few unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in comparison to countries of Europe, and in particular in countries of the global south. So as of March 2019, there were a little over 5,000 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in care in England. Because once children are here and make themselves known, the local state has the responsibility to provide them with care. So deemed to be the corporate parent, the local authority is charged under Section 20 of the Children's Act with providing support until children reach 18 and after as care leavers. And they could do this through foster care for children's homes, but they also use what's called other accommodation in policy, or often referred to independent or semi-independent accommodation. And unlike other forms of provision, semi-independent settings are characterized by accommodation rather than care. They're exempted from registering with the state, and they're unregulated. Unaccompanied children are overrepresented in this form of accommodation, as you can see from the statistics on the right. they make up only 6% of those children looked after by the state, but 43% of those living independently. Oh, sorry. So the state's use of semi-independent accommodation has been increasing, and the state justifies the overrepresentation of unaccompanied children, saying they're more likely to benefit than others. But there's no evidentiary basis for this, and indeed the limited existing research suggests a range of negative impacts of this kind of accommodation, and social workers, as Nando's work has shown, certainly give a general preference for foster care. So what's happening here? Why are unaccompanied children disproportionately placed in this provision, and what are the implications? So I want to suggest that this is part of a double move of enclosure that produces casualties of care. So first and foremost, in this sort of traditional uses of enclosure, I think that I suggest that the unpredictability of arrivals of unaccompanied children are used as a post hoc rationalization of the growth of a market in this area, and children's services more generally. So our interviews with policymakers, street level bureaucrats, and providers were permeated with, so these are the people working directly with unaccompanied children. Their language was permeated with market talk. We heard about placement markets, care markets, the need to do market warming and development, the need for market engagement events with contenders bidding to join the framework or bargaining over the quantity and cost of support hours. Most of the providers in this field are private, so it's a form of outsourcing and enclosure of what the sort of provision that was previously public. New entrants to the market, we heard, were often landlords with property portfolios rather than those businesses with experience with children's services. And so as Nathan, a shareholder of a provision, explained, some typical estate agents that have properties and they feel, oh, we can offer this to local authorities, and that they see it as a lucrative business. Nathan continued, they might not necessarily have the passion for that young person. They just want to accommodate. And if the local authority wants to save costs, then they decide to go for it. So these companies are entering often with little experience of providing children's services, and requiring limited sort of renegotiation of their business because it's largely an accommodation, a provision. And so it's growing, as a placement officer pointed out, the market's growing because it's an easier business to get into. There's less hoops to jump through, he said, because it's an unregulated sector. As I've suggested, many of our interlocutors, any of our interviewees, participants spoke about the interest of usually other companies about maximizing profits as a business aim. And the profit levels in this form of provision are the level of profitability is at 16.2%, which is higher than in any other form of even children's homes, which have been in the news quite a bit. So this creation of an independent care market that's by design easier to enter, easier to remain, and requires no regulation has significant impacts on both quality and stability. And it creates the conditions where those who may want to offer better quality may not be able to, in terms of the kind of competitive nature of this market. So again, what justifies this? Social workers don't think it's a better form of provision and so forth. Justifications from our participants were often linked to the unpredictability of new arrivals and the speedy responses required. So they come in very rapidly, quickly, we need to place them quickly. For national level policymakers, this was about being able to set up emergency accommodation really quickly in emergency situations to meet this hard end of the stick. So in this way, the sort of unpredictable presence of unaccompanied children in England's social care system is being used to rationalize not just a sort of enclosure through privatization, but an unregulated and for-profit care sector. And while the evidence leaves little doubt that this is the sort of unregulated nature of the sector is a factor in the explosion of provision, the notion of enclosure suggests that it doesn't have to be this way. These are political decisions being made about how this care or support in this case is offered. But I want to suggest that another kind of enclosure accompanies the privatization for-profit model, and that's that of children themselves. So in this case, children are being contained in many ways in semi-independent accommodation, not by bars and barbed wire, as we've seen in Nauru or Mexico on the American border, but they're not given a choice in terms of what borough they're placed in, with whom they'll share spaces, bathrooms, kitchens, etc., and the conditions of the space itself. So we've heard, numerous stories of vermin-infested, rat-infested locations where there's no response. The child has no response to that situation. And I think Nando's points about going missing from accommodation are telling in this regard. So the point here is, in one sense, that children are largely contained by this form of provision. But I want to suggest that there's something else that's happening here, and that's that children themselves unaccompanied children are being commodified. So as Brian, who's a placement officer for a local authority, explained, he encourages social workers to emphasize the positive characteristics of unaccompanied children when they're doing placements. It's not the nicest phrase to say, he suggested, but we're basically selling the young person, because providers make their money by accommodating young people, and we're almost advertising the young person to them. Brian was most explicit in this form of commodification of unaccompanied children, turning them into sort of potentially profitable commodities in a marketized care system. But this was echoed by other interviewees that we spoke to, often saying some of their great frustration. So Terry, who was a manager of a setting, he said, young people are being treated just like a parcel, a DPD driver, picking them up and taking them where they want to. Others commented on the fact that they had to bid on unaccompanied young people to place them in their home, and that the sort of horrors of in the 21st century talking about bidding on a human being. And so what I've been trying to describe here is that we see an enclosure of children's services in a more traditional sense of enclosure, a privatization, something that's was public, no longer public, into also a form of enclosure of a young person themselves, where they're transformed into a commodity in this sector. And so what does this all mean for unaccompanied young people? Well, and the state. Well, semi-independent accommodation allows the state to ostensibly maintain its commitments under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Children's Act, to provide some sort of support for unaccompanied children. However, I think the double enclosure I've been talking about ends up producing what Ethan, a local authority commissioning officer, calls a two-tiered system in children's services, where not all children and care leavers are treated as equally deserving and are subject, in Ethan's words, unaccompanied children are subject to the cheapest option we can possibly have for these young people. So while all children in unregulated accommodation may face similar issues with this provision, the precarity of unaccompanied children's immigration status increases the impact. So given the instability and questionable quality of the provision, it is not certain that unaccompanied young people are providing the legal and social support that they need in order to regularize their status. And so young people who have not managed to achieve this, the right to remain in the UK by the time they turn 18, and especially those who become appeal rights exhausted, are no longer entitled to the same kind of rights as other care leavers. And so what I'm suggesting here is that there's sort of a postponing. The technologies of border control are ever present, but they're just being slightly postponed within this double enclosure. And that some of these technologies of border control, like deportation or enforced destitution, are things that then happen at the end point of this process. So when unaccompanied young people's expulsion from care is no longer deemed to violate the sort of morally legitimated urge of liberal humanitarianism to protect the vulnerable, for which the child is a symbol par excellence, And when they're no longer profitable commodities for this sector, unaccompanied young people are no longer granted the same entitlements as others. And so I've tried to trace here how the intersection, some of my thinking, in progress thinking, about how the intersections of the UK's hostile environment and a care market produces casualties rather than beneficiaries of care, even when they seem in public imaginaries to be beneficiaries. And indeed, I suggest a care market does not care at all. But by tracing out some of the specificities of the social production of unaccompanied young people as casualties of care, I also hold out hope and take heed from what Jen's talked today, that there are forms of care and solidarity that that don't have to be like this, and that there are models for refusing spaces of paternalistic care, violent enclosure, and that care in the commons is possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that was so illuminating as well around the importance of recognizing how care has been marketized and its impact on children when they are asylum seeking, and the differences between different groups of children as well. So it's time now to open up to your comments and questions and so on. But first, could I ask that you all show some appreciation for what I think have been 3 excellent talks? I mean, whether you do that by putting your hands together or your thumbs up or whatever, that would be really great. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to turn over now to Eleanor to take the comments and questions.
Right. Well, we haven't, excuse me, we haven't got very many questions posted to these wonderful talks, 3 wonderful talks, and raising really profound issues and making connections between them. So first, one of the few questions that we've got so far was early on was Robert Moore. Do you want to ask your question? Robert? Robert, are you there? Right. Well, the question is in the chat was, were schools in Scotland and Wales also required to include country of birth and nationality data, Jen? Would you like to respond to that?
Sure. So no, because education has devolved, it was a national issue. So, but where children live across borders and go to school elsewhere, we just got to be careful to say it was children who were registered in schools in England that it would affect.
Mm-hmm.
And if we haven't other questions, Eleanor, I'd build on that though, I think, and tie into something that Rachel was saying at the end.
Mm-hmm.
I thought was really, really interesting about, and I think the links across these topics is this sort of dehumanization of children. And I think that's where the data aspects of this I found really interesting talking about you, because I was thinking something I forgot to mention, and I think it's really important, is how this hostile environment and the toxicity of the environment is being spread across the different sectors where children are found. And it's not only whilst migrant children then are scapegoated into these problems, it's affecting all children in other areas. One of the things the House of Lords had brought out that I forgot and wanted to mention was that they said in a debate in 2016, this proposal has all the hallmarks of racism. Mm-hmm. And they didn't say that lightly. It was because children of all nationalities were being asked to bring their passports into schools. And in particular, Schools Week had flagged that it was children in some schools of only who were not white British were asked to bring their passports in. So they were starting to pick up these elements of racism were very, very clear. This othering was a big problem, and ascribing ethnicity. Rachel talked about, the agency and autonomy of children being removed. It's also being removed from parents and families, as schools were being told if children hadn't submitted their ethnicity, for example, go ahead and ascribe it. Some school policies still said that. And that again, sort of reducing the humanity and the way that families and parents were being treated was were co-opted across these public services to enable schools to become this sort of policing the hostile environment, going into all sort of public servants, becoming extended public servants of the hostile environment. I thought was something that really struck me from what Rachel was saying about this sort of dehumanization of the process and taking people out of the process, becoming this sort of data-based aspect of what we were interested in, but it speaks to this sort of dehumanization and othering that is affecting all of this treatment that both Rachel and Nando were speaking about.
Have we got any other questions? Right, okay, that's Leah. Leah, would you like to speak? You need to, I think you're unmuted.
Yes, I can now, so it wouldn't let me at first.
You are
Sorry.
unmuted.
Yeah, I am now. Thank you so much for these amazing talks. I hope that those of us who aren't in the SSAHE, in the organization, can see the videos later. Because I really need to revisit some of these things. I guess my question is, and maybe this relates to some extent to what Jen was saying, in terms of some successes in campaigning, because the links that speakers have made about how privatization, which may not be the cause of the problem, but certainly exacerbated it.
Mm-hmm.
So my question really is, what, in terms of campaigning to change this, can we do, and the role of trade unions, because many trade unions, particularly, but not only in the public community sector, civil service unions, whatever they're called, PCS, I think, and obviously in the education sector, are very, very opposed to privatization for the impact on jobs, but also on the quality of services, and the fact that they're expected to be arms of the worst aspects of the state. So I just interested in what success or approaches you've made in terms of trying to make those links, because it seems to me a way of taking it outside the narrow sphere, if you like, of those who are concerned about, specifically about migrants. Anyway, that's my question. I hope that was clear. Thank you so much.
To whom were you directing the question?
Oh, well, I think anyone really, because I think it's relevant. I mean, Jen's experience of campaigning, and both Rachel and Nando talked about privatization, and Rachel in particular about it making it so much worse. So I don't mind whoever wants to grab it if there's time. I think
Okay.
Rachel was nodding, so that made
Okay, thanks.
I'll remute. Thank you.
Can I maybe add to this? I think we need to also look at the types of privatization, because in terms of the housing market, that's a different issue from the labor process, where unions have got more possibility of intervention. I wanted also to follow on from that, Rachel, to talk a little bit more about the privatization of the housing market, which is likely to get worse in relation to what's happening in the cost of living crisis and so on. If you could talk about that. And the final question or point that you made is, you were talking about refusing, and I just wanted to take this back to Jen's talk in terms of what possibility is there, and this is also layers of any resistance or attempt to change the situation. So Rachel and maybe Nando after, if you'd like to respond.
Sure, thanks. Well, that's huge, wonderful questions. So to try and be quick. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting in your question, Leah and Eleanor, what you picked up in is about what focus on privatization provides us. So quite often when we think about the campaigns that happen in response to the conditions and situations of migrant children, whichever group we're talking about, they tend to be made on quite moral grounds, and with the figure of the child as a kind of symbol of the innocent, needy other. And I think that in many ways does a disservice to any possibility of resistance. In some ways, it's because of what it does to the child or to children. It sort of evacuates any agency or political participation from them, as Nando spoke about. But I think it also ends up hurting others because it sort of says we only care about this issue, or we want to make this change for those who are deemed deserving. But as we know about those sort of deservingness arguments, they can be very easily undercut. A child can be turned into an adult between one day and the next, and therefore undeserving. That sort of thing can happen quite a bit. Or a migrant child with their parent can be deemed undeserving, and all of the repercussions then fall also onto the child. So in short, I think, or in long, I think one of the things that's quite helpful is to take a more contextual, more political, economic, socio-political take on these issues around childhood and child migration. And I think the questions around privatization and outsourcing are a really fruitful way to do that, both analytically, but also kind of organizationally. And I also think there's some really interesting ways of thinking about resistances and refusals that happen in the everyday. So a big part of the project that I didn't speak about is about the care that unaccompanied children provide to others being other children, but also to their social workers, to their teachers, to people in the communities that they live in, and so on. And so I think thinking about these sort of ways in which care that refuses to enter a logic of the market, that's a really, I think, interesting and again, and a fruitful way of thinking about building, movement building. Yeah, I'll stop there so other people can add in.
Thanks very much, Nanda. Before we turn to you, no, just 1 minute, just to say there are some questions posted about can people get references? And secondly, the talk itself, we are recording it and it will be available on the website once it's been downloaded and it'll be put on. And in the chat, there are some references, obviously not a lot, but there are some. And maybe if our speakers would like to provide some references, we could add that to what we put on the website. Just so, Nando, would you like to take up the button?
Yeah, no, I mean, when in the project Becoming Adult with Elaine Chase, I mean, one of the things we were very interested was the overlap and tension between the discourse around the child protection and the migration policy and the child policy. One important, interesting aspect was basically this sense of abandonment of the policy in the transition. You know, you turn 18 and then is where things change. I mean, Rachel was showing the number around the forced removal, which is, it's really interesting. I mean, it's true, children don't get deported, but they get deported from when they're 18 and 1 day. I mean, the point is there is a really sharp threshold there. In some cases, it's a threshold that gets sort of diluted in time if there are appeals, etc. That we've done some research on that as well. But the point on the mobilization is also an interesting one, because what we found was that if you frame child migration and right for the protection of the children only through the children framework, there was a gap also in the vocabulary provided to the NGOs, those that mobilize for the rights of the children, because they didn't know what to do once these children were no longer children. They were no longer under their mandate. And then, so the abandonment was not only in the policy, but also in the advocacy. And so making visible this transition was a way to raise this issue. So what we do, is there a protection to the right to the future in the children protection framework? Or to what extent can we make the future of children as part of the campaigning, of the advocacy argument for us, in order to have a vocabulary for mobilizing for the rights of those that were formerly unaccompanied minors?
Any further questions?
If there's not, I can come back briefly to your point about the privatization of the housing market.
Yes,
Eleanor.
please. Yes.
So, I mean, one thing that's important to say is that this other accommodation that's provided to children's services is provided to within the children's services framework rather than a housing framework. And it's commissioned by local authorities. And so the local authorities could technically commission charities or nonprofits to provide it, but the vast majority are private for-profit companies. So one of the things that's quite interesting in our data when we started to look more closely at this sector is who is providing accommodation. Because it's not the same players for the most part that we see in asylum accommodation for adults or for families. So it's not G4S and Serco, those big companies. It tends to be much smaller organizations. So they're smaller businesses. Usually they fit into a small business portfolio. And as I said, they might have a small property portfolio, a couple of houses, and they think, right, here's a way to, the story we heard from our interviewees was, right, here's a way to take our property portfolio or small property portfolio and get some assured rent paid by the government in a fairly straightforward way. And so this is the sort of nature of what's happening, is it's kind of the sector is dominated, it's small, not a lot of people. And so it's dominated by a sort of mom and pop type business, but with designs or future plans for greater growth and expansion. So I think it has a particular characteristic that might be different than what you're talking about in terms of the way that asylum housing has been privatized, or the broader privatization of any kind of social housing.
But it becomes more, but it also becomes more profitable now, given the whole cost of living crisis, and and the searching for profit of these small landlords. You know what I mean? That's what I was getting at. So
it offers a guarantee.
Exactly.
It's a low risk. And again, this was the story that we heard over and over again, is this is a low risk agreement to make, because you have an assured income coming from the local authority. You have an assured payment. So you're not going to run into rent arrears issues.
Robert has posted up. Would you like to say something? You posted up an addendum to your original question to response from Jen. Okay, well, I'm not sure if your mic is working properly, but what Robert was saying is that Wales is a nation of sanctuary, but immigration not devolved. So an interesting divergence of UK and Welsh policy.
I think I've opened Robert's microphone.
Okay. Robert, do you want to say anything?
Yes. So, at last I've been given my voice.
Right.
I mean, this is typical of a number of policy areas where the various devolution settlements are leading to conflict between England and Wales and Scotland. I mean, this is the most serious one that we are discussing today, but Wales is committed to being a nation of sanctuary and has just adopted an anti-racist Wales equality plan with the rather, I mean, I like it, but it's a rather fanciful ambition to overcome racism in Wales by 2030. But, there's that ambition. That is the direction in which one of the devolved administrations wishes to move. And clearly, UK government policy is beginning to interfere with the devolution arrangements. And this is illustrated. It's not the most important point about what we've been discussing tonight, but it is another example.
Thanks very much. Jen, did you want to add anything? And then Anne's got her hand raised, so if she could have the final say, and then we'll have to close.
Well, thank you. I suppose in answer to questions about other forms of resistance, cities of sanctuary was one of the key elements in our campaigning, and were significant in their support of the Against Borders for Children work. You know, individuals can stand up in terms of, you know, councils and electoral meetings that are coming up in the local elections on our, you know, in the next few weeks. Things like making sure that we encourage friends and family to know that there's now a requirement of voter ID, to make sure that we don't have that, you know, minority and particularly ethnic discrimination that we're likely to see, and encourage people to get out on the vote and make their voices heard, I think is really significant. And to make sure that we understand that these issues are not only now about migrants, but this hostile environment is affecting everyone, including renters. When you're talking about housing, having to produce the right to you know, be able to document yourself in all these situations is spreading into all these different aspects of, you know, being able to vote, being able to rent, being able to attend school, being able to qualify, for example, for student loans. And that surveillance across the whole of society is being perpetuated by Home Office, hostile environment policies. So I think we need that resistance to be cross-sectoral, interdisciplinary, that research is open access, that we can access the expertise of researchers across civil society and work together, that we can evidence these case studies and get sort of more information into the public domain quicker and faster, and making sure that we have an evidence base to be able to, you know, present these arguments. And this resistance collectively across different elements of society is one strength I think we could all share. And I really look forward to doing more in the future. Thanks
very, very much on that note. Anne, would you like to have the last question or comment?
Well,
I don't know.
Well, I won't now pose it as a question because there is no time for people to answer it. But the point that I was hoping people would be able to address is the intersectional one, which is that children are not all children within the things that you've been talking about. In that, for example, teenage boys are not viewed as either innocent as migrants, and you know, the weaponization of their cases is very different. So, you know, where does gender come in is what I was going to ask about. You know, this notion of dangerous teenage boys who are not really children, you know, and who have to be checked. I mean, sort of, you know, there are some ways of subjecting them to age verification. But I don't want you to answer it now because I know that the session has to end. But, you know, from me, before Eleanor thank you very much. It's been so thought-provoking, so interesting, so important. I think we need another one on children.
Yep, hear, hear. But can I say that it is work that both Nando and I would have done in the you know, the crossing of the Mediterranean in some form or other. It is totally gendered, and especially unaccompanied minors. So you're absolutely right. It's a crucial issue that we need to talk about as well. But can I just thank everybody, the 3 wonderful talks, the fact that they also came together, and I think are really exploring crucial issues, which some of them, you know, we don't even know about. And just to say also thanks to everybody being here. So can I just say huge thanks. And lastly, the material will be available as soon as we get it downloaded and put onto the website. And hopefully there are some references in the chat, but maybe some of our the 3 speakers might be able to provide a few more references, and then we could include those as well. So many thanks. And as Anne said, I think we need a second session sometime in the near future. Thanks again.